So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another custom scenario. Today we return to a battle from Tommy the Wise, although in terms of theme to this one, it may have actually slotted in a weird way neatly before the last one we just did, albeit in that situation Dol Amroth had already been conquered, so I'm not entirely certain that, narratively speaking, it would have tied together. I don't know what the overall outcome of this one is going to be after all, but this one is dubbed Corsair Island, and it is a flat battle between Umbar, mostly, at least in terms of the units that are within the island itself and its fortifications and mountains. Going to be Corsairs set up within the interior, and then a relief force made of some of the stronger elements of Umbarim society, and Dol Amroth are going to be trying to root them out here. I'm sure there are named islands. I'm sure that I can pick one out within the Bay of Belfalas or something like that. Clearly not Tol, but I'm sure there's something else that will fit the bill, expressly named or added in as fan fiction later, I'm not sure. But yes, having a look at this one, it's actually a somewhat shorter battle than the ones we've seen over the course of the past couple of weeks, I suppose. But it is still going to be largely a siege-focused map. As I've already mentioned, the defenders, which are going to be Umbar today, most of the, well, all of the forces that are on the island itself are going to be made up of the Corsair units, so most certainly not the highest tier of unit, and there are a few units as well that are from older versions of the game which we don't get to see in standard rosters anymore. We'll go through them in a moment, I'm sure, but Savages and Pikemen and the like. Overall, not the kind of units that are going to be winning any races in terms of quality. The Blackguards are a little bit of a difference maker there, but it's going to be all about formations. It's going to be all about trying to be as efficient as possible for the forces within the mountains here, and the relief force that comes to help them later on has got some of their heavier hitters. So the question really is whether or not they can make Dol Amroth pay dearly enough to the point where those relief forces are enough to sweep Dol Amroth from the island. For Dol Amroth, it's really very simple. Try and leverage your quality, try and leverage the fact that the Corsairs are not going to be quite up to the same standard as your more heavily armoured troops here. So, you know, Corsairs, generally speaking, are going to be significantly weaker to ranged attacks and the like. They do need to be quite careful, though. The Corsairs do have some pretty nasty ranged attacks on stuff like the Blackguards and the Corsair crossbowmen, of course, so savagery of attack is something that Umbar can certainly utilise to their advantage as they wait for the reinforcements to arrive, and Dol Amroth, it's going to be all about, I think, being a little bit patient and a little bit careful about the dangers that the Corsairs do present. But yeah, going to be quite an interesting one, this. We'll go through the attackers first and foremost, which does mean we're going to be going around the perimeter of the island first and foremost. No boats nearby, but Dol Amroth have made landfall, starting off once again. What a name, famous Austrian painter is. But yes, Dol Amroth. Athalond men-at-arms, as I've already mentioned, this is the kind of unit which, under normal circumstances, may find itself either just evenly matched or outclassed by a lot of other line infantry in the game, because a lot of the Western Kingdoms of Men, they don't go all in on this kind of unit, they just tend to be quite functional. But against basic Corsairs, they should do just fine, even against the more heavily damaging Corsair Savages and the like, which will be able to do a lot of damage in return, because Corsairs tend to have lower defensive values generally. The Dol Amroth infantry should be able to do a decent amount of damage in return, even against units which under normal circumstances they wouldn't trade too evenly with. But yes, by the numbers kind of unit this, but for Dol Amroth on this occasion that may be enough to cause some serious problems. Belfalas Marines, the Corsairs do have a little bit of an edge in terms of their javelin men, both at range and certainly in melee when it comes to the Corsair Blackguards, but the Belfalas Marines will still do the same job for Dol Amroth. Armour piercing itself is not going to be too important against the Corsairs that are in the middle of the island, but maybe later on when the relief force does arrive and Umbar start to flex their muscles in terms of their heavier units, if they do still have a unit like the Belfalas Marines left over at the end, it can be exactly the sort of thing to help Dol Amroth then take on the role as defenders digging in the middle of the island, if of course they're able to take the middle of the island. Athalond Halberdiers, as we've already mentioned, armour piercing is not going to be the most important thing, at least not initially, but perhaps later on. And even then, having an anchor is still going to be very, very useful. They will still be outranged even by basic Corsair pikemen, but yeah, phalanx units are very important to the meta of Reforged as it stands. I can't see that changing in the near future either. So yeah, Athalond Halberdiers will be useful for consolidating gains and setting themselves up. This is the kind of unit which I think is going to be absolutely vital for Dol Amroth's success in this battle moving forward, something like the Perithil Champions, because huge base damage values, lowly Corsairs are going to be rightly terrified about trying to face the Perithil Champions, or of course their big brothers, the Haven Guard, in sustained melee, purely because of those big base damage values, and the fact they don't have armor piercing is usually the downside to heavy swordsmen, but of course when facing Corsairs that is going to be less of a concern for the reasons we've already mentioned. And yeah, Perithil Champions should be ideal for this kind of situation. Over here, unfortunately for Dol Amroth, at least this army, Dismounted Knights the Silver Swan take the General's Bodyguard unit instead of the Haven Guard, but even this kind of unit is still going to be very, very good, purely because, again, Corsairs, other than their armor-piercing projectiles, are maybe going to struggle to keep pace quality-wise with this kind of unit, but, I mean, they are somewhat scattered here, Dol Amroth. They don't have the advantage of having utterly overwhelming numbers, and certainly not against a rather numerous pirate force in the middle of the island. Stuff like the Tarnostian Spearmen are going to be less frightening. They will still be reasonably solid on the front line in the same way that the Athalond men-at-arms will be. But yeah, Spear Malice, going to be a little bit of a concern, maybe for Dol Amroth, because they are going to need to be fairly efficient and fairly swift once they do commit to melee against the Corsair defences. The Tarnostian Spearmen will merely be making up the numbers in that regard, but they are the attackers after all. They will need to rely on numbers, at least to a certain extent, to start overwhelming the enemy, rather than just quality. More Athalon men-at-arms, more armour piercing in the shape of the Black Swan Renegades as well, which, again, that may be best left for later if they can help it, but they may not have a choice. They may need to commit forward units quickly to try and break the back of the central defence as fast as they possibly can. It turns out they do have a unit of Haven Guard, and it can be used more freely as well, seeing as it does not contain the General. Yeah, the Corsairs are going to be very, very worried about the Haven Guard. Umbar in general don't have a unit which can really keep pace with the Haven Guard in terms of a pure infantry unit. And certainly the Corsairs are not going to be up to that task either. A second unit of Dismounted Knights, the Silver Swan, so really not lacking for quality, this Dol Amroth army, with more Belfalas Marines, more men-at-arms, and more halberds. They do lack the pikes, perhaps, which is one potential gap, and it's not the most numerous Dol Amroth army here, this on the northern part of the island, but that quality is going to concern the Corsairs in the middle, but they always knew it was going to be an uphill struggle initially in this battle. Scouts of Entertainment, it's good to see him around again. I don't remember the last time I casted a battle with him in it, actually. It may have been close to a year ago at this point, so that's neat to see. Once again playing as Dol Amroth, of course. More Athalon men-at-arms, so the initial wave is going to be functional infantry here, and he also has got the armour-upgraded Doran Ernil pikemen. Now, we mentioned the potential downside of the halberdiers before. That's not something the Doran Ernil pikemen will have to worry about, and indeed with the armour upgrade as well, they certainly will be a far superior option in comparison to the inevitable Corsair pikemen we will see in the centre of the island, and it makes for a perfect anchor really, but they do need to be a little bit careful because the Corsairs do have ranged options which can burn down pikemen pretty quickly, so timing is going to be key with utilising those pikes. More Athalon men-at-arms are there. We've got some Belfalas Marines also, more Perithil Champions, the extremely dangerous unit, which Dol Amroth will be hoping to lean more heavily upon. More Dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan and looming menacingly. A couple of units of Tirithea marksmen here as well. Something which we didn't really notice from the previous Dol Amroth army was archers, and that may be a bit of a problem for Dol Amroth if they don't have too much in the way of archers, because Corsairs of course can be especially vulnerable to this sort of thing, and they will be hoping to target down in particular stuff like the Corsair crossbowmen if they can help it, because that's one of the main dangers to Dol Amroth in terms of trying to expedite a quick victory for the middle of the island there. Another unit of Haven Guard as well, which will be of great concern for the defenders. We have yet more of his forces over here, yet more quality as well. Not the biggest Dol Amroth armies this, but certainly packed to the rafters with quality, with more Dismounted Knights the Silver Swan, more Tirithea marksmen, some more javelins as well in the Belfalas Marines, Black Swans, pikes, and a further unit of men-at-arms. And then over here we have the Warlord, who has got another Dol Amroth army. Athalond halberdiers once more. We've got some Dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan, some more Belfalas Marines, some more Tarnostian Spearmen, probably the lowliest Dol Amroth unit on display here. We can see the battle getting underway immediately, with some of the Tirithea marksmen having already loosed this battle. There's something I've noticed about Tommy's scenarios, actually, that they do tend to get underway right away. There isn't a deployment phase, which I actually think is a good thing for the most part, especially if you handcraft the deployment zones to be, more or less exactly where you want each army to be. There's no need for a deployment phase, really. It doesn't work for every custom scenario, certainly, but I always appreciate it when it happens, because it means that we can get right down to the action very, very quickly. But yes, arrows already in flight, the Corsairs ready to receive them, the Thalon men-at-arms, as we've already mentioned there, and then the rest of his army over yonder by the looks of things, with some more Haven Guard, devastating unit that, Black Swan Renegades, more Thalon men-at-arms here in numbers, plenty of halberdiers, so no pikes in this army once again, we're seeing the halberds again, Belfast Marines and Parathil champions once more. We also have some more Parathil champions, so yeah, lots of heavy swordsmen, so it's not the sort of thing that they're going to have to be too frugal with. And the final attacking army, Y2K86, with some more Belfast Marines, some Tirithea marksmen, some Thalon men-at-arms once more, got some Tarnostian spearmen back here, more Black Swan Renegades, more dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan, pretty much the same sort of thing. And once again, instead of halberdiers, it's pikemen. That seems to be the main difference between the armies, really, whether or not they have access to pikes or halberds. Based on the makeup of the defending armies, I think I'd much prefer the pikemen on this occasion, although having a few halberds for later on could be a useful thing, but we'll see how the battle develops. They may not have the luxury of saving units for later Dol Amroth. More dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan, the Thalon men-at-arms and Parathil champions. So let's get on to the defenders, shall we? We'll start off with the relief force, which is over here. I don't know what the exact specifications are on when the Womb Raider is going to be permitted entry to the battle, but I would imagine there's at least going to be a small period of time that passes before they are allowed to move, purely because otherwise it's going to get pretty ugly out here pretty quickly, and I imagine, just based on their positioning, that it's intended that they will arrive a little bit later on. And this, of course, is where all of the traditional higher-end Umbar units are going to be. So not a huge army in terms of numbers, but in terms of quality we are going to be seeing quite a lot here. The Locked Morale Ardenayim Shield Guard, more of a defensive unit than anything else, but late on, when Dol Amroth are tired and the Corsairs have done a fair amount of the heavy lifting, this level of quality may be exactly the sort of thing to break the back of the attackers. Alcarondas Legion, in terms of a line infantry unit, Umbar certainly have the beating of Dol Amroth, though with the amount of heavy swordsmen they have at their disposal this time, it may not be as simple as all that. More Ardenayim Shield Guard, more Alcarondas Legion, got some, more than one unit based on the looks of things, of fully upgraded Balakith units as well. The Shield Bearers, which armour piercing is going to be pretty much universally useful against Dol Amroth, just as it is against the Gondorians. Balakith Axe Guard, even more aggressive in terms of their initial setup and kit. Balakith Marksmen, I mean, that is one thing we did note. There are Tirithea Marksmen to be seen among the ranks of Dol Amroth, but by the time the Balakith Marksmen show up, I would imagine that the ammunition supply is going to be largely spent from those, so it may be just a nice supporting tool to try and really hammer home a late game infantry advantage of some description. More marksmen, we've got the Harbingers of Castamere back here as well. They're very strong, but they're not as strong as the Haven Guard, and the Haven Guard are here in great numbers, so it's the sort of thing which is worth remarking upon. More Axe Guard and Balakith Marksmen, but yeah, that's the sort of thing. So plenty of Balakith units, Black Numenorian units, not the biggest army. There is a unit of cavalry as well, which is quite interesting, that, the Alcarondas Faithful. No Dol Amroth cavalry on the field today, so they're going to be more of an annoyance than anything else, because melee cavalry does have a tendency to be less effective at charging into infantry, but hammer and anvil strikes are going to be easier to get later on in the battle. Now then, Medexa playing as one of the pirate armies here in the middle of the island. Corsair Fencers hidden here up against the cliff face. Corsair Fencers, of course, in terms of their ranged attack and their abilities in melee, will be one of the harsher tests that the elite Dol Amroth armies face as they try to march through the island. And cool use of the projectiles may very well be very important. Corsair infantry going to be one of the main things that Umbar are going to have to rely upon here in the middle of the island. Armour upgraded though they are, again, they do have that ranged attack, and considering the relatively low amount of archers Dol Amroth are going to have to rely upon here, that may prove to be important, but they don't have the most ammunition. They're going to have to be used as some sort of bulwark at some point, and it's all about trying to buy time for other units maybe to do the business more so than they. Standard Corsairs are not in the game as it stands anymore either. They used to be the fodder tier unit for this particular faction, and that says all you really need to know. They're going to be here to stand in the way. They're not going to get a huge amount of kills, but buy time for stuff like the Blackguards and the crossbows to try and inflict a little bit more damage, and also perhaps stand in the way of something like the Corsair infantry to allow it to utilise all of its ammunition supply. Corsair archers are still in the game, and they are not a particularly high tier archer by any means, but ranged attacks are going to have to be how Umbar do most of their initial damage here, as the first phase of the battle goes about its business. We shall see though. Corsair Savages are going to be another unit which Umbar are going to have to rely upon to maybe punch a little bit above their weight. They are a very fragile unit after all in terms of their melee defense, as I was mentioning earlier on, but that armor piercing is going to be useful for dealing damage to pretty much everything Dol Amroth have, but you have to worry about the melee defense and complete lack of armor that these guys are rolling with, especially if they come up against those Dol Amroth heavy swordsmen. As much as the armor piercing will inflict a bit of damage before they fall, they'll probably get one swing before they get bisected by men that are far better trained and equipped than they, but perhaps as part of a combined arms front line supported by crossbow bolts, Umbar can engage in the damage spikes that they need. More Corsairs, more Corsair archers as well, even more Corsairs, another unit of Corsair infantry. We have got some more Savages, and back here the all-important Corsair Blackguards. Not only are they going to be very damaging with their javelins, but they're probably the most sturdy melee combatant that's here in the middle of the island as well, so it goes to show what level of quality Umbar are going to have to make do with here in the middle, at least to start with. Just in behind we do have some more Corsair crossbowmen as well. Well, actually this is the first unit of Corsair crossbowmen that we've spoken about them plenty already. We haven't actually seen an example of them yet. Even more important, generally speaking, I would say, than the Blackguards, because they're going to have more ammunition. We've all seen how damaging crossbows can be in this version of the game. And yeah, they're very weak to arrow fire, but Dol Amroth don't have the most archers at their disposal, so very important. And in terms of holding the line, the Corsairs' best bet is going to be to utilise their Corsair pikemen to achieve this goal. They can form a decent anchor, but what are they actually anchoring in place is the question I would ask. Standard Corsairs and Corsair Savages. The upgraded Corsair infantry slightly better, but it's going to just be about trying to hold the line for as long as possible for those pikes, or for those crossbows and blackguards to do the business. The fencers maybe a little bit better as well. More Corsairs and crossbows there. Having access to these siege pieces, the ballistae here in the middle of the island is also going to be fairly important, but sightlines are everything with the ballistas. I don't know necessarily whether they're going to be able to get the best sightlines, but it's another tool which they're going to have to try and buy time for, and the melee units buying time is really all they're going to be able to do for the most part, and the ballistas, blackguards and crossbows going to be the key. Tommy the Wise himself is the central of the three armies, and I imagine it's going to be very, very similar, so we'll go through his army a bit faster. Ballista, more fencers as you would expect, with more savages as well, the now defunct unit. More crossbows and archers, yet more pikemen, savages and standard Corsairs ready to go to the south part of the mountain range if they're needed. Blackguards, Corsair infantry and standard Corsairs, savages all ready to meet the advance of scouts of entertainment. As we make our way further down, yet more infantry, more Corsairs and blackguards, another entryway there. And this is something worth bearing in mind is Tommy needs to hold on to the middle, otherwise the Corsairs could find themselves split off from one another, and T.S. Niehoff is going to be the last of the Corsair armies here in the middle. Corsair archers, savages, pikemen, more crossbows, more blackguards. We can see more standard Corsairs and savages, pretty much exactly the same as we've seen before, crossbows and the like. Corsair archers, does he have an artillery piece as well? It doesn't look like it actually, just as a standard overview, unless I'm completely blind, but the other two Corsair armies do have a ballista that they can utilise, but Niehoff here is not going to have that luxury. He also has two fairly close choke points to watch over, but we'll see. Sightlines for the crossbows are going to be very important here, but we're in the part of the battlefield where arrows are already flying, so without further ado, let's begin. So if I had to make a prediction of this battle, I do think that the quality of Dol Amroth should be enough if they're willing to move quickly and aggressively through the settlement. Yes, the crossbow bolts and the ballistae are going to be a concern, but they're going to be a problem regardless of the pace that you take the battle at, really. Maybe you can mitigate the damage that the ballista is going to be capable of doing if you take your time a little bit more, but the crossbows are going to be there no matter what, and I do think they are the true threat that Dol Amroth actually face. And ultimately, if you're aggressive as well, you'll be really putting the screws to what is ultimately a pretty poor quality front line that Umbar are going to have to put on, at least initially. And then of course later on we will be seeing the relief force arrive, and Dol Amroth really needs to be getting the lion's share of the work done before those more elite Umbar troops do arrive on the scene, but they've got the quality level necessary to really do that, Dol Amroth, so it's going to be an interesting one, this. It's going to be a case of whether or not those really high damage projectiles are enough to make up for the real shortcomings that the defenders have, so it's almost a bit of a case study, this battle, as well as being a fairly neat little theme. Corsairs, first time in quite a long time that we've seen them get involved, and the Corsair Savages as well, who will actually do fairly decently against this level of troop that Dol Amroth have decided to send in initially. As we quickly flit around the battlefield over here, we've got more Athalon men-at-arms over yonder, Corsair Fencers revealing themselves over here. Bit of a blank shot there, only a portion of the unit actually through their projectiles. The Athalon men-at-arms are going to try and get into melee as quickly as they can, but certainly by the time they get there, the Fencers will have the beating of them in melee, and that's exactly the sort of engagement that Umbar need to be seeing quite a lot of in this battle. Something I would be concerned about from an Umbar perspective may be a sight lines for the crossbows, although by the looks of things, just as I say that, there are some Corsair crossbowmen heading up onto the hilltops as well, so there are maybe some elevations that the crossbows can take advantage of, and that could be exactly the sort of thing that proves to be incredibly decisive as the battle goes along. Athalon men-at-arms colliding with yet another unit of Corsairs stood directly in the way. This is looking like a pretty full-on sort of assault, and as a matter of fact, by the looks of things, they are going to be willing here, the defenders of the centre of the island, to actually split themselves off into two sections. I guess it doesn't matter too much about reinforcing each individual section. All they need to do is hold out for as long as possible and do as much damage as possible. Overall victory isn't the most important thing, but allowing Dol Amroth to control this little junction does mean that effectively the mountain range is going to be split into two sections, and Tommy the Wise is going to have this area to deal with. Athalon men-at-arms, in fact, you know what, at this point it's time to go down to half speed, at least temporarily, because there's going to be an awful lot happening. It's not the longest battle in the world anyway, so it won't be artificially extending things by too much. But they're already shaken here, the Athalon men-at-arms. They're trying to be proactive, trying to find those gaps, as we have seen many attackers be more willing to do in a lot of these recent custom scenarios. They have been willing to be aggressive and try to get in and around defences, which generally speaking is a good idea, but you need to be able to reinforce these positions pretty quickly, and a single unit of line infantry here isn't going to be the answer when you consider the presence of these Corsair pikemen as well. They're going to be moving in to help shore things up. We have Corsairs and Corsair Savages again, the combination which is across most of the battlefield at this point, the effectively fodder that the standard Corsairs are, trying to buy a little bit more time perhaps for the armour piercing on those Savages' axes to strike true against more of these units of Athalon men-at-arms. And it's one of the better engagements the Savages can take. I don't know what the juddering is all about. It's a little bit concerning. Does it happen when we're at full speed as well? It does. That's a little bit strange and peculiar. No matter. Going back down to half speed then. The Warlord moving forwards as well. Some of the Corsair infantry already in melee as well. And let's not forget, under normal circumstances, this would be seen as a bit of a desperate move. But on this occasion, actually, the standard Corsair infantry is, I mean, probably one of the better melee combatants for holding a line that the Corsairs actually have access to here in the centre of the island. So we'll see if that's going to be enough to keep them in the fight for any length of time. Tirithea marksmen trading back and forth with actually some Corsair crossbows already placed into harm's way. Maybe a little bit of a mistake. We've already mentioned how potentially important this unit is. They don't really have the best line of sight here for crossbows either, but needs must. It's better to use them now than suffer the fate of not using any of the ammunition and ultimately coming unstuck as a result of that. No forces are actually making their way down this road, however. Scouts of Entertainment has decided to move his entire force to maybe try and claim the middle section here, which is probably the most fortified area, but it's also one of the more dangerous areas as well, given the fact they've got some more elevation to work with, Umbar. The artillery is being forced back, however, by the advanced Tirithea marksmen, so Dol Amroth certainly doing their due diligence there, trying to defang the artillery a little bit. But it is interesting to forego attacking one of the choke points, given the fact that they do need to expedite their progress through these areas fairly quickly. Corsair Blackguards on the way forward, Interesting little counter-attack going on out here by the Corsairs. Madeks are maybe sensing that there is a little bit of an opportunity to take the fight to Dol Amroth before they get situated within the choke point. These Thalon man-at-arms are going to be held at arm's length by the Corsair pikes, but they're going to easily be able to defeat these standard Corsairs. Corsair infantry, of course, as we've already mentioned, made of sterner stuff, especially with that armour upgrade, than many of the other Corsairs that we've already seen, but when they're head-on against halberdiers as they are here, it's still not going to end all that well for them. And then, of course, there's the real showstoppers out here, the Corsair fencers, who did a decent job early on against those Thalon men-at-arms, but Dol Amroth rightly identifying them as one of the greater threats that they can deal with, sending forward a unit of dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan to crush them underfoot. The Corsair fencers far too lightweight to deal with a unit like this, and they will also be sandwiched between them and a unit of Parathil champions, so Dol Amroth taking no chances here, trying to deal with these more elite units as efficiently as they possibly can. So we head over to the other side where the Corsair crossbows are up on the hill, 2 units of them by the looks of things indeed, and a decent enough angle, better than they would manage from behind their own lines. I mean, what they're going after, volume of kills is something to be, there is something to be said for sheer volume of kills in this kind of situation, so I don't necessarily blame them for going more directly after the Thalon men-at-arms. Just in behind we've got some halberdiers, Swan Knights are back there as well. Standard Swan Knights. This one unit of men-at-arms needs a little bit more assistance, but again, dividing the attention is the painter between 2 front lines. How ironic is that? But yeah, they're going to need more reinforcements here if they're to keep this attack up, and just having individual units be laid low and not really making too much progress is a victory for Umbar here. Let's not forget that really victory or defeat is going to be more on the shoulders of the relief force than it is of the Corsairs within the island's interior. So any unit that they can kill off in its entirety is going to be definitely welcomed. Thalon arms. The reinforcements are a little bit far away, so if Scouts is to get this assault underway quickly, then maybe another counter-attack from Umbar will be the answer as we make our way towards the Dol Amroth occupied crossroads, although Umbar have actually decided to move in and contest this little junction once again. Some Corsair infantry stood in the way of further unopposed Dol Amroth progress, and these Thalon men-at-arms are still not really going for it. I mean, in these early stages, Dol Amroth, they are attacking, but they're certainly not attacking with the kind of venom that I would have suggested would have yielded better results, as we were talking about in the army composition phases. And we'll see about that as the battle goes along. We've got the Black Swan Renegade, so something a little bit more serious in terms of unit power being committed as well. Maybe trying to fully surround this unit of Corsair infantry now and break their spirit quickly and regain control of this little crossroads. And then further back down here, still more Corsairs. The fact that TS Niehoff has only got to focus on this one choke point now is a real blessing, I think. As much as Scouts will gain more traction on this choke point by focusing his entire army on it, I really don't think that it was necessarily the best idea to completely forego going down this choke point, even with just like 2 or 3 basic infantry units, just to give Umbar that thought in their head that they effectively have 3 choke points, Niehoff, to try and contest. The one in the north, along with Tommy, to try and reclaim that crossroads from Dol Amroth. Obviously this one from the Warlord, which would be the main focus, because Warlord has only got 1 choke point to worry about, but also another one just to siphon off more units. And with the level of quality that Umbar are dealing with, I don't think that they would have reacted too well to it. But as it is, they can focus more readily on this choke point, and even if the quality in the end is still enough to crack through the Corsair lines, efficiency is the name of the game for the defenders in the encampment here. Any little boosts they can get, they will take, I'm sure. Haven Guard and Belfast Marines moving forward. I mean, the Warlord has been probably the most aggressive of the Dol Amroth forces so far, and he hasn't really got an awful lot to show for it. I mean, there's plenty of dead Corsairs, I suppose, but there's still plenty more where that came from. Well, as we hover over this area, that Corsair infantry is still fighting actually, and with the Black Swan Renegades in the distance that we'll have a look at in a minute. Dol Amroth trying to anchor themselves in place now, and with their pikes on the front line, this is where the Corsairs could start to come unstuck a little bit. I wouldn't fancy their chances of facing Dol Amroth when they really get situated here. Not the best angles to utilise Corsair archers, blackguards as well, so a little bit of range support coming in. Projectiles are the best way to try to deal with those Dol Amrothian pikemen. Further down the line, more units now arriving to pressurise this section of the front line from Tommy, and this is what Y2K needs to do based on the full focus being on the centre from scouts on the other side. If he can pressurise this area as well, could be a very good thing. Meanwhile, the artillery in a very good position to take advantage of the Dol Amroth blob. That may actually be enough of a reason for Dol Amroth to pull away from that front line a little bit. The Corsairs moving in as well. I do actually quite like how subtly aggressive Umbar have been in these kind of situations. Given the lower tier nature of the units they have at their disposal, it's risky. But they have been rewarded for this so far. The Black Swan Macemen going to be cracking some skulls, however. Corsair archers and crossbows trying to do their thing, but that particular battle being contested by the Tirithea marksmen. Nice hits once again from the ballista. We are seeing more of a concerted effort now over here as well. The basic units being committed forward first. Standard Corsairs being killed en masse, but the Savages will offer a little bit more of a harsh response. Tirithea marksmen getting onto the slightly higher ground. Corsair crossbowmen are there, definitely should be one of the first targets for all of these Dol Amroth archers, as we've already mentioned. And those Corsair crossbows, they're going after the pikes, so interesting that they recognise the pikes as a greater threat potentially than the archers. The archers, if left unopposed, will kill off these Corsairs fairly fast. But the pikes, they do represent a problem, even for the more elite relief force as it comes in the later game. Probably would appreciate the pikes no longer being there. The ammunition supply is very likely to be gone at that point anyway. The ballista being pushed up the hill as well. Again, not necessarily the most comprehensive attack on this front line. The Corsairs, the Savages and the pikes all pretty comfortable so far, and I think it's mainly as a result of the crossbowmen able to take up a position on top of those hills that this Dol Amroth force has elected to not be quite so aggressive. And over here we're seeing maybe a little bit more in terms of higher quality units, but the Blackguard's in a good position. And so far I think Medex has probably been the most comfortable Corsair army, but that has largely been a result of aggression not being quite such a high priority over here for the Dol Amroth force attacking from the northern edge. Savages being taken off the front line, Belfast Marines being committed in once more. Still, I think this is the most significant engagement on the field as Y2K attempts to make this stick, but we can already see that at this point in time the relief force is on the way, so fairly early as we approach the 5k frame mark, which I think actually we can go up to regular speed now. The relief force is on the way, and that's bad news over here for Y2K because he finds himself between a bit of a rock and a hard place. The artillery is attacking him, he's getting hits from both sides. We did see previously that unit of Corsairs take a more aggressive stance as well, so the crosshairs are clearly on him. There's also a few of the elite forces that we can see on the minimap heading northwards as well, which the slightly slower nature of the Dol Amroth assault there may start to come back to haunt them. We shall see. Tirithea marksmen firing a few missiles in. Blackguards in there also. Here in the south, we can actually see that the Warlord has sent over units to attack via this direction as well. Thalon Men-at-Arms, Perithil Champions. I don't know if Niehoff is necessarily prepared for this. Some Corsair archers may have to stand in the way, otherwise what's left of this front line is likely to fall apart, although the fact that Perithil champions are force pathing their way through already is probably a sign that, at least here in the south, Dol Amroth are making the kind of progress that they do want to be seeing. So that is very worth bearing in mind. In fact, I think we are going to have to continue to utilise a bit of half speed. We can see the heavier units have arrived. The true power in the south, the Black Númenóreans, are here. Dol Amroth's attempt to wrest control of this island away from the pirates has garnered some greater attention. Balakith Axgard getting in and amongst the Knights of the Silver Swan. Damage being dealt is swift, and as much as the Wanderers of Nimrodel are a danger, they are also fairly exposed here, and the need to try and attack down 2 lanes has proven to be a bit of an intimidating factor here for Dol Amroth, clearly, because they haven't wanted to do it. That much is fairly clear. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. Corsairs doing quite well for themselves so far. Scouts' defeat is a distinct possibility. The crossbows are no longer up here, but the blackguards represent another very high damage projectile that's going to be coming the way of that infantry. And there are going to be elite units coming in later on, but are they going to be in the kind of numbers necessary for a Dol Amroth victory, or is it going to be too little too late? I think what Dol Amroth can take heart from is the fact that this little southern section of the mountain range is going to be falling into their hands at some point, I would imagine. Well, there goes one of the Dol Amroth generals. Although artillery can also play its part over here. Perithil champions, it says defeat seems certain. I mean, to be fair, there are Corsair fencers in here. Corsair fencers not to be taken lightly either. Javelins on the way in. Defeat seems certain for the Athalon men-at-arms as well, so a little bit more pressure needed from Dol Amroth, but they did manage to get through the initial defensive line of the Corsairs, which Dol Amroth have not managed anywhere else as of yet. And I find it unlikely that Y2K is going to be the one to do that either. That ballista has been in an ideal position. There's not much in the way of terrain within the mountain range over here, but that one little hill has given the ballista all the elevation it's needed to effectively stop Y2K's assault in its tracks. And maybe what the situation called for was getting the archers closer to that ballista and shooting the crew, because continuing to batter your head against this particular wall has resulted in hefty casualties being sustained. Even if Y2K is actually making some decent progress, and he could maybe link up with what's left of the Warlord's army, the south may be taken, but I worry about the rest of the mountain range and Dol Amroth's ability to contest that particular area. Ardenheim's Shield Guard moving in first, interesting choice. Y2K does still have his Perithil champions on hand, and as far as a damage dealing infantry unit goes, they may be actually the cheaper of the 2 units, but they will win when it comes to a pure melee contest, especially with a little bit of support coming in from some Belfalas Marines as well. So Umbar, quite rightly, sending forward some standard heavy infantry to support. Y2K has been under quite a lot of pressure, lots of different angles that he's had to try and cover, and he's actually put up a decent fight doing so. I do think he will be the first of the Dol Amroth armies to be, maybe not completely fall, but be rendered less of a factor in the battle as it goes forward. Athalon men-at-arms over here as we make our way northwards. There is a lot of death occurring here. The slower nature of the attack over here has, yes, the very disturbing death animation that we saw Dorwinian also have in a few battles ago. Still says that Dol Amroth are in the ascendancy, even with the relief force now active and really making life much more difficult for Dol Amroth. It's just the Haven Guard victory seems certain, even though the Balakith shield bearers are all about them. 2 units of those macemen there. I don't know, positionally I really do feel as though Umbar are in a pretty damn good spot. What's going on over here? Alcarondas faithful, making a nuisance of themselves. This little lake makes it far more difficult actually for the Painter and Scouts to link up for any sort of duo assault. It'll be quite a long march if the Painter wants to retreat from the north and consolidate their forces. That may be one way Dol Amroth can go about their business, but to do so would really blob them up a little bit and allow something like the crossbowmen to do the business on them. Mounted Knights of the Silver Swan as the Alcarondas faithful galloping off into the distance. Again, being an annoyance, and still over on this front line it's very much the same story on this choke point that it's been since the very earliest stages of the battle. Dol Amroth are contesting it, but not with enough numbers that would be necessary for them to actually make anything happen. So it's certainly not going to go their way, unfortunately for them. Corsairs' victory seems certain. We make our way to the centre of this encampment, which still is pretty secure, honestly, and that's one of the reasons why I'm continuously backing Umbar in this situation. Much more like it, though, this assault from Scouts now. He's not under the kind of duress that the Blackguards and crossbows were putting him under not too long ago, but this is maybe the sort of thing which needed to be happening a little bit earlier anyway, because these Corsairs, they're only going to last so long in this back and forth on the front line. They are going to need some support from elsewhere. Maybe this can be the saving grace of Dol Amroth as well, as the ammunition supplies start to run dry and it becomes a melee only kind of affair within the centre of the island. The Corsairs' weaknesses will be exposed, especially in comparison to the higher end units that Dol Amroth have to work with. Oof. Nasty hit there though from the rear on those Corsair fencers. Tommy the Wise able to get in behind them, and that is enough to rout off some of the more basic units comprising this assault. Make our way through the south. We already noted the fact that they were actually pushing forwards here, Y2K, and some of his units have made it this far, which is fairly impressive, and this may give just that little bit of support peripherally to the Warlord to push through and take this section of the encampment at least, and maybe he can then push north and the dominoes can start to fall, but I don't know. Easier said than done. Of course, our Blackguards firing in. Those javelins very, very useful for trying to blunt the effectiveness of these dismounted Silver Swan Knights. Not a huge amount of progress being felt over here once again, but much like with the engagement Scouts is engaged in the northern section of the map, or the centre of the map I should say, the quality in a pure melee engagement like this should really favour Dol Amroth as the battle grinds along. We shall see if that turns out to be true. Plus Marines, Tirithea Marksmen and Halberds still in reserve for Dol Amroth as well. So we take a little peek over there. Scouts is pushing forward with more of his units. Pikes are on the front line as well. Crossbows trying to get into position, but Tirithea Marksmen posted to prevent that from happening. Interesting situation here in the north. I think the Painter realises the fact that he's not going to be able to defeat Umbar given the arrival of the relief force, so he's instead adopting a little bit more of a defensive stance, a little bit more of a wait and see approach. That will only be okay for a little while longer, because if all of those heavier Umbar units are allowed to just run roughshod over the rest of the Corsairs, then that will prove to be a fatal error. Y2K taking rather the opposite approach, a significantly more aggressive approach as well, where he tries to meet the challenge of the heavy infantry columns heading his way, and that will ultimately result in his defeat, but it will buy a little bit more time for them to, as I've said, take that southern section of the mountain range, and it will also give a little bit more time for Scouts to try and make a little bit of progress into the middle of the map as well. The amount of damage that can be done by Y2K over here is also going to be, I think, really, really important. Balakith Marksmen actually caught out a little bit. Belfast Marines are only going to be able to do so much damage, but I do like the movement here. Another Corsair general has fallen. Those axes are striking true. Perithal champions, 32 of them. Is that going to be enough to finish off these Balakith Marksmen? And then on the beach itself, yeah, Ardenheim Shield Guard, probably one of the least appealing kind of units they could be fighting in the Black Swan Renegades, and actually a unit from the Warlord over here, so a little bit of support coming north. giving Y2K just that little bit of extra time, a few extra kills inflicted as well on the more elite Umbar on the field. Moving into the middle, this little crossroads, which was the site of probably, I'd say, the most significant engagement so far. Still ongoing as well, technically speaking, from Y2K, but not too many of the dismounted knights, the Silver Swan, left, and they will surely rout. So victory will ultimately be the defenders in this little section, though it could facilitate attacking advances elsewhere. What have we got going on over here then? He is moving forward once again, re-establishing himself and pushing in on this front line once more. But this assault from Medexa, there is actually some Haven Guard in behind enemy lines. I don't know how on earth they were allowed to get over here. Did they kill off all of those Balakith shield bearers? I mean, there's not really anything left from Umbar over here by the looks of things, so I guess they did. Much of the relief force did go after Y2K, I suppose, so more of a token effort over here, and Medexa may end up paying the price for that. So the patience that Dol Amroth have displayed here in the north may actually end up paying real dividends. Haven Guard in behind the lines. I mean, this front line, which has been relatively comfortable throughout the battle so far, is finally going to be laid low. Again, it's not going to be instantly the case, but as with many of these completely Corsair front lines, when it comes down to just pure melee in this battle so far, this is how it's going to be. Meanwhile, here we have more of the heavy units that were assisting against Y2K now moving through into the middle of the map as well to help out Tommy the Wise and pushing Scouts of Entertainment's attack back. And given the concentrated nature of Scouts' army going through this one choke point, this is a wise move. I think Balakith Axguard will be a very welcome sight indeed. That little bit of extra armor-piercing punch, exactly what the situation calls for here against Dol Amroth. More on that in a moment though. As Dol Amroth are making progress through here, the south of the map is now theirs. The Warlord moving through, certainly not unscathed, but with an army of genuine strength left, and with the Painter also seemingly going to be victorious in the north. Tommy the Wise is going to have to be pretty careful in the middle, because they will find themselves surrounded, Scouts under pressure at the moment. There is still more of the relief force from the Womb Raider as well yet to be committed, so there's a few ways in which this battle could still go. The Alcarondas Faithful could yet be a very important unit in the late game as well. Sword cavalry though they may be, the mass does much of the heavy lifting from cavalry when units are completely exposed, and late game they have no choice really but to completely expose themselves. Corsair archers being committed to melee as well. Black Swan Renegades on the front line, as we've already mentioned, they are actually superior in comparison to the shield bearers, but numbers wise and also the amount of armor piercing being delivered to the front line should really help Umbar's cause. One of the Dol Amroth armies has their general route, which is probably Y2K's actually, now that I think of it. Yeah, there he goes, you can even see him. Of course our Blackguards are there. It's a little bit messy of an engagement once again. Balakith Marksman moving forward from the Womb Raider. Ooh, stabbed on the retreat. Rest of those units coming forward, and a little bit of support from Tommy the Wise coming in as well, which may be necessary to ultimately bring the Warlord's advance to an end. But more units are yet arriving. Belfast Marines. Quite a few units are yet arriving. A full unit of Black Swan Renegades as well, so I don't know whether actually Umbar are going to have enough to completely stop the Warlord's attack, given the presence of still fairly healthy Haven Guard, though that artillery still firing away. Going to be very, very important. That could end up being the most important unit on the battlefield, honestly, with how it dealt with Y2K earlier. Now the Warlord as well, the routing it can induce can be just as important as the physical damage that it's dealing. And finally, the Painter will have the northern edge of the mountain range under control. Worthless peasants, eh? fair amount of strength bound up over here as well. Knights of the Silver Swan, Black Swan Renegades. Not in the same kind of numbers that the Warlord had from the south, but yeah, the announcers still not feeling their chances, and it may be because they still have 3 genuine threats. They still have scouts attacking the middle directly, and it looks as though he's starting to get some joy because of the sheer quality he still has at his disposal. They still have the Warlord attacking from the south, who is attracting a lot of attention now, but has enough numbers still in the bag to endure it, and then the north as well. If one of those wasn't the case, Umbar may have a little bit more confidence going into the later game here, but as it is, I'm not entirely sure. The sheer lack of ability that the Corsairs have in melee, given the amount of the armies that were reliant upon it, may end up being key. And also, the crossbows, to give the attackers their credit, many of the Corsair crossbows have been adequately dealt with by the marksmen that Dol Amroth have at their disposal. And I always thought that was going to be one of the key things Umbar needed to do the business in this fight. The artillery has been useful, at least one of the artillery pieces has been exceptionally useful. The relief force has not been the coup de grace that maybe it could have been. Defeat is a distinct possibility. Defeat seems certain for Balakith marksman. Surprisingly, those dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan did take a bit of a hammering at the hands of the artillery, but the artillery has since had to move, given the imminent danger from Scouts' advance. Haven Guard still being alive and still being in these kind of numbers is also going to be extremely worrying for Umbar. Belfast Marines moving on. Harbingers of Castamere still here, trying to contest with the Haven Guard, but actually they're already more damaged, so there's that. Belfast Marines moving in to help surround the Ardenheim Shield Guard. Routing is impossible, but a more efficient melee engagement is certainly not. The Alcarondas Faithful are on the way back down to try and get some charges off. The Ballista has to shoot into Scouts' advance, really, because there are so many gaps here that if Scouts moves forward with everything, then the Ballista would be exposed in melee, so they need to try and get as many shots off into that advance as possible, moving as quickly as they possibly can. It's probably been the most significant single unit that the defenders have had at their disposal, but alone it's not going to have been enough, I don't think. I think routing at the hands of the cavalry and the artillery may be their best hope, but given the higher end nature and given the fact that Dol Amroth are in the ascendancy, I find it hard to believe that they'll be able to rout units off in that way. Victory is a distinct possibility for the Corsair Blackguards, but a little bit more quality will surely turn that around. And the attack from the north is also somewhat inevitable. They set up a front line ready to meet that advance, Medexa, but Medexa's going to have to turn around because that attack is not quickly forthcoming, and there are greater threats to their continued existence in this battle. Once again, we fly over the Alcarondas Faithful after they've presumably got a few charges in, and indeed they have, battering down a few of these Belfalas Marines. Corsair fences in place. To be fair, Corsair fences a little bit dangerous. Still got a bit of ammunition left to them. Are they going to be quick enough? I don't think they'll be able to outright defeat Dol Amroth down here, but they can certainly do a little bit of extra damage with those projectiles. Yeah, unfortunately the unit just didn't want to fire. I think some of the units were still too close to that melee engagement over there, so the rest of the unit didn't want to fire. And the Warlord rightly recognises the danger and is going to be force pathing some Black Swan Renegades to go and deal with that situation. Alcarondas Faithful, ballista shots whizzing past, going into a blob there. Umbar not quite out for the count yet. The level of quality they have to deal with is a difficult thing to overcome, but it's not impossible. with some of the tools they have left. And now, unfortunately, with the Painter's army arriving from the north, Medexa had to come down here to shut the door in Scout's face, but that just means that the Painter is going to have a free hit at the artillery, and without that ballista, I don't even know how much ammunition that ballista necessarily still has left, but I don't know. We shall see. Corsair pikemen still alive. Pikes, late game pikes, only really going to be the heroes that Umbar need if they're fighting on in one direction, which is probably not going to be the case, especially not when they're already trying to surround that part of the front line. The Tirithea marksmen can surround them pretty easily if they want to, but yeah, they rout fairly quickly. Alcarondas faithful trying to stop the advance, but it's not going to work, and that ballista finally has been silenced. The Black Swan Renegades will deal with the ballista crew. Is that where the battle truly ends and it becomes more like clean-up? I don't know. Alcarondas faithful trying to rout the Renegades. The rest of those units in and amongst with Scout's army now. I just don't think Umbar have got enough left. When you survey the situation, the numbers are in favour of Dol Amroth at this point, as well as the quality. So surely that can only mean one thing. Fencers doing a decent job. The Renegades preventing them from firing their projectiles, but they're learning the hard way that the Fencers are actually a very accomplished melee unit as well. And they do end up routing as a result of that. 77 Fencers, is that going to be enough? As we're in the very late game, 4% is the difference in favour of the attackers though, and we all know how difficult it is for defenders to recover from a situation like this, although in a 4v4 it is a little bit different. They're not quite in the hole as often as they are in a 5v3, though on this occasion, because of the quality discrepancy, you could argue that kind of equates to the same thing. So many of the engagements, rather than being outmatched in terms of sheer numbers, they've just been outmatched in terms of the fact their units are clearly not of the same level outside of the Womb Raiders relief force as the Dol Amroth soldiers that are menacing their lines. And once again, early on, I didn't like the way that Dol Amroth had set their stall out. I thought it was a little bit risky, but in the end, their quality has seen them over the line, and I do like how there was a little bit of patience employed. It wasn't just a brainless advance. There was clearly thinking that went into it. Plenty of generals falling in quick succession now that pretty much all that everyone has left is being committed to the same fights. It's kind of understandable. Belfast Marines, the Corsair infantry, routes, and of course when things start to go south like this, when much of your army is made up of Corsair class units, this kind of routing is going to be how the battle ultimately reaches its conclusion. Corsair Fencers still alive, they'll at least give a slightly better accounting of themselves, as we've already seen in this battle so far. Some of the Corsair Blackguards also. Still a few units over here, again Corsair Fencers, so I think this is going to be the final unit left standing for the defenders, just because they're facing off against a slightly smaller force, albeit of the very best Dol Amroth have to offer on foot, but I think the other unit is, well, actually probably the Alcarondas Faithful, if they really want to, can be the last ones left standing. They can kite, of course. Haven Guard still alive, and yeah, ultimately it has been the quality. Dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan doing the business. Those Corsair Fencers falling by the wayside as well. Alcarondas Faithful charging in, trying to do bits. Some routing Dol Amroth units. It looks like they're coming back to the fight, but they're not actually. So will it be the Fencers fighting on foot, or will the Alcarondas Faithful charge into situation first that allows them to perish. Charging in there to the dismounted knights, the Silver Swan. Two-pronged charge with the fences as well, so again, I don't think there's been necessarily too much wrong with the way that Umbar have conducted themselves. I think the crossbows could have been used a little bit better, but most of the reason why they weren't was because of the attackers using the marksmen to deal with them, which was always going to be key. And there wasn't much the Corsairs could have done to actually prevent that from happening, because their own archers simply wouldn't be able to kill off the marksmen quickly enough with the heavy armour that Dol Amroth were wearing. And I also like how subtly aggressive, as I mentioned, Umbar were being in certain parts of the battlefield as well. When they saw an opportunity to do a little bit more damage with even standard Corsair class units, they were taking it, and that was always going to be key. They needed to do more damage to Dol Amroth, or as much damage as possible to Dol Amroth before the relief forces arrived. It wasn't enough in the end, but they definitely gave a good accounting of themselves, defending with the level of units that they had in the middle. It's a very interesting kind of concept where there's a more elite reinforcing army and the initial defending armies are sort of a ragtag group almost. I do rather like that, and actually I do think the very next battle is somewhat similar. Another scenario that Tommy has made, where there's a reinforcing army that arrives a little bit later. Different kind of setup there, but we'll be able to see it in a different kind of situation as well. But yeah, I like the way this battle was constructed, and in the end I think we do get to see the fact that quality will carry the day if the discrepancy is large enough. As much as Dol Amroth were taking damage, ultimately when the ammunition supplies started to run dry for those defenders, those entirely Corsair based front lines found themselves too outmatched. But like I said, not a bad effort. I mean, this is pretty much everything. There's a couple of units on the periphery over there as well, but not a huge amount left. 5%, probably going to be 6% by the time the battle ends, but that's a close one. That is a close one, and I have to say, all of these scenarios that various people are making, they're actually making very, very competitive ones. At this point in the game's life cycle, I suppose, people are very, very familiar with how it works. People have gotten very, very good at creating interesting battles that are mechanically close as well. And this one is certainly no different. And there goes the Wound Raiders' relief general. So the Black Numenorians, unable to assist their pirate underlings, and this island does fall into Dol Amroth's hands after the last battle in Lebanon. Dol Amroth redeeming themselves, having been previously conquered by Umbar, I suppose, in a very weird kind of setup. But yes, I do think worthy victors in the end. Dol Amroth, they were constantly on the attack in various ways. I like the patience. Umbar did very well, but ultimately that quality discrepancy was always going to be fairly difficult to overcome. And like I said, given the nature of, or the scale, I should say, of the quality discrepancy as well, it was kind of like, maybe not a 5v3, but maybe like a 4v3 in favour of the attackers because of that. You know, the level of quality overall and balances of power and all that, something definitely worth bearing in mind. I would like to also single out Y2K as well, because he had probably the least appealing advance initially of all the Dol Amroth units. He had reinforcements attacking him from the rear as well later on, and he was effectively, I guess, the sacrificial lamb of the attackers here, because he was really the only one that didn't have a presence later on when it was very clear that Dol Amroth did have control, with the Warlord, you know, claiming the south, you know, the Painter claiming the north, and Scouts making real progress through the middle. Y2K was the only one that wasn't really a part of that, but that's because he took most of the heavy hits on the chin for the team before that. So, you know, special mention to him, I suppose. But let's see what did the damage for the Umbar armies. Let's see what Corsairs did particularly well. Corsair archers getting over 100 kills on more heavily armoured Dol Amroth troops is not too bad. Savages, maybe that's not quite so good, but we did mention earlier on that the problem the Savages have is, as much as they will do damage to Dol Amroth, their defences are so low that much of the Dol Amroth roster is pretty well suited for killing off units such as them as well, so both units are going to be effective against one another. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, it's the more devastating units of ranged power that the Corsairs have, which did much of the damage. The Ballista getting over 200 kills, which is obviously very good, and like I said, perhaps the most significant unit on the field for Umbar on this occasion, even though the crossbows did end up doing more damage, which, again, considering the fact that I felt as though the crossbows were dealt with reasonably well by Dol Amroth, it is a sign perhaps that it is difficult to keep track of all of the ranged units doing their thing on a battlefield like this. The Blackguards is a fairly decent return. Under normal circumstances I'd say that's fine, but I think maybe they needed to do a little bit more. At the very least, both of them needed to be getting something like 150 in this kind of situation, given the fact the Corsair Blackguards, along with the Fencers, are far and away the best melee combatants they had in the middle of the island. Down here, very similar story. The melee units, of course, really struggling against the quality, but the ranged units doing pretty well. Ballista not quite as well on this occasion, but still acceptably, I'd say. Again, the crossbows getting over 200 kills, so maybe I was wrong in that respect. Blackguards, again, decent. Fencers, decent. Not really, you can't really ask for too much more than that, but I guess you need to, because the battle did end in Dol Amroth's favour. This Ballista, maybe that's another possible unit that needed to do a lot better than it ended up doing, only 30. Corsair Blackguards doing well, very well on this occasion. The Fencers as well, punching above their weight. Less for the crossbows, but that's made up for by the Blackguards and the Fencers there. And Archers once again doing decently in part. So yeah, the ranged units of the Corsairs doing well, but not quite well enough. Maybe you do need to be unreasonable, I suppose, and ask for a little bit more out of your units on this occasion. But yeah, a nice, unique kind of battle that, and a nice theme to go along with it as well. We've been seeing quite a lot of the Evil Men factions of late. Many of the custom scenarios I've been given in this little run include them, and that will actually include the next one as well. We've still got 2 custom scenarios in this little run to go. Another one from Tommy the Wise, which will be coming up next, which is another Candish rebellion in one of their settlements as Rune and Mordor attempt to bring them back to heel. And then we do move away from the Evil Men theme, as we will be seeing a slightly edited version of one of the Mirkwood maps, as Mirkwood attempt to fight off a very large host from Mordor, and that particular one is from the Flame of Arnor. So those will be the next 2 that you see coming up after this one. Following on from that, we will be taking a look at another historical scenario that was given to me by Lord of Balagost as well, kind of similar to the ones that we saw scattered throughout December, so there will be another of those towards the end of the current month as well, which is technically another custom scenario as well, though it's a slightly more of a pitch battle focused one, that one, than the sieges that we've been doing, so I guess it's 3 more scenarios. And moving past that, there's a few sort of regular sieges, I suppose you'd say, have also been sent to me. I've got one on the old version of Moria that was sent to me by 2 times. I got sent an old version of the older version of Thranduil's Halls as well, sent to me by Winged Swordsman 44, although that is a slightly edited version of Thranduil's Halls, I think, so there's a little bit of extra interest and spice added into that one as well. And there's another one from 2 times which completely escapes my mind at the moment, but again, there's quite a few left. Ultimately, I've still got quite a few on the backlog, so that can only be a good thing. And something else I do intend to do as well at some point in the first part of the year is to round off the Knockout Tourney videos by doing the Sword Cavalry as well. I don't know exactly when that will be. I want to prioritise doing these more custom maps first, so it may be in about a month's time or so, but it's still the sort of thing which is going to be on the horizon, and that will round off that kind of video ahead of hopefully what will be the release of the new patch later on in the year. I will of course keep people posted about my general status as the year goes along, because of course there is going to be a fair amount of upheaval. It's pretty much nailed on at this point that I will be starting the new thing at the beginning of April, which does mean that I'll probably be moving away from South Wales towards the end of March, that sort of time, so there will probably be about a week or so where I won't be able to record, but by which point I'll have such a hefty backlog saved up that that shouldn't really be a problem, and the schedule can continue as it will. But yes, I'll keep people posted on that, and I'll also keep people informed about what things may very well change organisationally on the channel as a result of that. But for the time being, at least for the first quarter of the year, it will be very much business as usual, as it has been for the past 2.5 years or so. But yeah, enough of my rambling. Big thank you to Tommy the Wise for creating this scenario and deciding to share it with me. Long may this sort of thing continue. People making new maps and new scenarios is the current lifeblood of the game. Yeah, like I said, long may that continue. Big thanks to all the players for being a part of this battle replay as well. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.